There have been plenty of bad acquisitions throughout gaming history, all struggling for a multitude of reasons. We've seen studios that fell off right after being purchased, potential great partnerships that just didn't work out as expected, or poorly led new management dragging down once great teams. But I'm not sure I've ever seen a purchase that has been more of a net negative for all of the parties involved than PlayStation's acquisition of Bungie in 2022. It has been a total train wreck, a messy situation emblematic of everything wrong with both individual companies. So as Bungie's future now hangs in the balance, let's take a look back at how in the world we got here. As most of you probably already know, PlayStation placed a major emphasis on live service multiplayer games throughout the PS5 generation. Best known for their cinematic single-player experiences, Sony felt the industry was passing them by, as basically all of the most played games in the world don't fit that description. The games with the most players, and perhaps more importantly, the games making the most money right now, are all multiplayer games. When you looked through PlayStation's first-party catalog, it didn't take a gaming expert to see they had no real foothold in the space, leaving them vulnerable as millions of gamers began dedicating all of their gaming time to live service. So they did what I felt was an understandable move, investing into live service and trying to find their own smash hit. It was a goal that was completely logical, however it was also one that quickly went off the rails. Sony invested tons of money into this initiative, greenlighting over 10 games, buying studios they had formed second-party partnerships with, and even going as far as allowing their most important first-party teams to delve into live service projects. But no investment was larger than the one they made in January of 2022, when it was announced they would be acquiring Bungie, creators of Halo and Destiny, for a staggering $3.6 billion. From the very beginning, their partnership was a bit unusual. First and foremost, it was a style of investment we had never seen before from PlayStation. When you look throughout their history of studio acquisitions, you can see a very obvious pattern. They like to work with a team for several years, shipping multiple projects together and building a strong relationship before making it official. You can trace back that same lineage from nearly every studio they own, and it's a strategy that has been extremely fruitful for them. In the case of Bungie, however, all of that was completely thrown out the window. Bungie and PlayStation had worked together in passing, sure, such as PS4 players receiving some exclusive content in Destiny, but that is nowhere near the level of synergy Sony typically looks for when tying the knot. This new addition to PlayStation Studios was also quite different in how it was being structured, with Bungie saying they would remain a multi-platform studio who would publish their own games everywhere despite now falling under the PlayStation banner. This distinction left many wondering what exactly Sony had just spent $3 billion on if it wasn't for control of Bungie or their IP. Well, according to head of PlayStation first party Herman Holst, it was primarily so they could leverage their experience in live service. They saw an opportunity to get a very talented team under their roof, one that had revolutionized multiplayer with Halo, and one that had defined live service with Destiny. PlayStation wanted to infuse that expertise into their internal studios and current live service games in development. They felt Bungie's history could serve as a valuable asset as they embarked on their personal live service journey, and that they could lean on them when encountering aspects of the space they were unfamiliar with. It seemed questionable whether that plan would be worthy of multiple billions, but in a time when money was cheap and M&A was at an all-time high, Sony felt comfortable making the move. I think it's also worth noting that their main competitor Xbox had been buying up every studio they could get their hands on, putting pressure on PlayStation to respond. I don't doubt investors were breathing down their necks, pushing them to react. That's the only real reason I can put together in my mind to explain why Sony would make such an out-of-character decision. Because not to mention, Bungie wasn't exactly the most attractive company out there at the time. Just Just 1 month earlier, the studio had come under fire after former and current employees reported claims of sexism, racism, abusive bosses, excessive crunch, and more. The entire Bungie management team was ripped by these sources, not only for those previously mentioned serious issues, but also for simple bad decision making that was negatively affecting the quality of their games. Management issues aside, their future game output was also fairly uncertain. Destiny 2 was entering its 5th year on the market, and a natural decline was to be expected. Meanwhile, with no other projects being currently unveiled, it would likely be many years until they could have another game ready to ship. Regardless, the deal was done. Sony had gone all in with Bungie and would lean on them as the live service push continued. What could possibly go wrong? Shortly after making the acquisition official, Hermen Hulst told investors that Bungie was performing what he called a rigorous review of their live service games in development. That same month, Deviation Games, a newly formed studio composed of Call of Duty veterans who had signed a deal with Sony back in 2021, saw massive layoffs and a game cancellation. Many assumed these two things were related. However, we've now learned Deviation was apparently not making a live service game despite their Call of Duty connections. A more tangible Bungie-related cancellation came in late 2023 with The Last of Us Online. Naughty Dog had been working on this game for quite some time. Having started as a simple multiplayer mode for The Last of Us Part 2, it eventually grew into its own standalone installment. It received an official announcement at Summer Games Fest 2022 and was said to be a full-scale project along the lines of a traditional Naughty Dog experience. The Last of Us Online was of course going to be a major tentpole of Sony's live service push, as this was one of their most valuable IPs. However, things changed in 2023. According to reports from Jason Schreier at Bloomberg, Bungie's internal review of Sony's live service games had flagged Naughty Dog's project as having some potential issues. Reportedly, Bungie expressed concerns about the game's ability to engage players for long periods of time. Additionally, Bungie sat down with Naughty Dog leadership and laid out just how much goes into supporting a live service game, and warned that it could quickly consume them. Shook up by this feedback, Last of Us Online development was scaled back in May of that year, with Naughty Dog reevaluating its future. By December 2023, they chose to cancel the project, saying they did not want it to overtake their studio and would instead focus back on the single-player games they are known for. This series of events left many concluding Bungie were responsible for The Last of Us Online's cancellation, and it caused a lot of anger from the PlayStation community. Keep in mind again that many had assumed Deviation's canceled game was also live service, meaning in the eyes of PlayStation fans, Bungie had now killed 2 of their games. Not exactly the best first impression, but I personally feel that anger was misplaced and avoided some of the important context. With The Last of Us Online, Bungie did not walk into Naughty Dog headquarters and say, "Don't make that game." They simply explained what it was going to take to support it. Naughty Dog did not feel they could handle that and chose to move on. While that was certainly disappointing for those of us who wanted to play the game, I can't say I'm too upset at that outcome. How many times have we seen a traditional single-player studio try to transition to live service? And how many times have we seen that completely blow up in their faces? A Naughty Dog distracted by the support necessary of a live service game is a terrifying outcome, and I'm glad it didn't happen. The only real shame here is that they wasted so much time before coming to that conclusion. And the fact that Sony even needed Bungie to come in and explain these things in the first place is a pretty clear indicator of why their live service push went so poorly. How did you allow your most important first-party studio to spend years on a live service game without properly outlining how they would support it? That should have been a conversation that took place on day one, not something that comes up multiple years into development. So while it may have been easy to blame Bungie, I feel it was actually a sign of PlayStation's multiplayer incompetence more than anything else. And over the next several years, that multiplayer incompetence would come to define the PS5 generation, with colossal failures like Concord, various cancelled games such as a Twisted Metal reboot and a God of War live service game, and so many studio closures it's become hard to keep track. As we fast forward to today, it seems PlayStation has largely accepted defeat, starting to scale back on live service, which leaves Bungie in a very weird spot. But first, we should rewind a bit and see what Bungie was up to while Sony's live service aspirations crumbled around them. When they weren't busy being blamed for game cancellations, Bungie was working on a new project of their own. Marathon, the first game they would make as part of PlayStation Studios, was revealed in May 2023. As an extraction shooter reboot of their obscure IP from the 90s, it didn't exactly have the making of a mass-market industry-defining experience Bungie fans had come to expect, but it was said to be a smaller, more experimental project for the team, one that wasn't supposed to replace Destiny 2 or take precedent over other potential projects. So with that in mind, Bungie faithful were willing to give the game a chance and see where things went. But that generous mentality would begin to shift as Marathon's development would become utterly chaotic. In October of 2023, Bungie saw 100 members of the team laid off as part of Sony's cost-cutting across their studios. Destiny 2 player count had begun to fall off a cliff as its upcoming expansion, The Final Shape, was behind schedule, and Marathon was still years away, making Bungie a major target for job cuts. In July 2024, they saw another massive round of layoffs, with 220 employees affected. This meant over the course of just a few months, Bungie had dropped from around 1,200 employees to 850. Sony then ingested one of Bungie's unannounced projects, taking over development under a new studio that would later be unveiled as Team LFG. So suddenly, Bungie looked around and saw their workforce had essentially been cut in half, Destiny 2 was struggling to stay afloat, and one of their promising internal projects was gone. So in the blink of an eye, their future had now become dependent on Marathon, a level of expectation it was never really built for, and that would only become more apparent throughout a disastrous 2025. Marathon was set for release in September of that year, with an alpha test coming in April. Responses to this test were less than ideal though, with players not yet sold on Marathon. Many worried about the current lackluster state of the game, considering its intended release date was not all that far away. But this disappointment would quickly be overshadowed by something much, much worse. In May of 2025, an artist on Twitter known as Antireal alleged Bungie had stolen her designs and put them in the game without permission. She had originally become suspicious all the way back in 2023, but chose to wait and see what actually made it into the player's hands. Once able to review gameplay footage of the alpha test, she was stunned to see blatant plagiarism of her designs. It was more than just some similar looking fonts, it was literal copy and pasted imagery, down to exact words, numbers, and iconography, including even her own personal logo. Bungie had gone through multiple other plagiarism controversies over the last several years, but this one was particularly devastating, because Marathon's cool art style was just about the only thing anyone was actually praising about the game at the time, and now that was ruined too. In a pivotal point of development where Bungie needed to sell audiences on their game, it had instead become the face of plagiarism. They promised to do right by the artist and conduct a review of their assets to remove all applicable imagery, but the damage was largely already done. As the team now prepared to sift through every single asset they had, all while addressing the many gameplay concerns from players, the decision was made to delay Marathon indefinitely, pushing back a game that was already years behind schedule even further. CEO of Bungie Pete Parsons stepped down 2 months later, with Sony announcing Bungie would lose its independent status and be restructured into a much more traditional role overseen by PlayStation Studios. So to recap, Sony had originally purchased Bungie in order to learn from them because they were so good at what they did in live service, but now, within just a few years, Sony was basically running the company themselves just to keep it from imploding. Fantastic stuff. By 2026, this new look Bungie was finally ready to release Marathon, and despite all of the negative press it had endured throughout development, it actually received fairly good reviews. I cannot speak to Marathon's quality, as I have not personally played it, mainly because I'm just not a big fan of the extraction shooter genre, but those who have played it extensively have had glowing things to say. Marathon also seems to be quite sticky, with those playing it staying engaged for many, many hours. The only problem, though, is that there aren't that many players to keep engaged. Marathon's player count numbers are far below what you would want to see from a major AAA release, and with PC reportedly being the game's largest platform, we can conclude its console numbers likely aren't much better. This brings us back to what I said earlier about Marathon's initial pitch. I don't know that it was ever really supposed to be a massive game. It is a reboot of a relatively unknown IP in a very niche genre, originally started as a secondary project. The problem, though, is that all the mayhem at Bungie throughout the 2020s now meant everything hinged on it. With Destiny in a bad place, and their other internal project now in the hands of PlayStation, Marathon was kinda all they had left. But expecting a game like that to change the fate of a studio as big and expensive as Bungie was never going to work. Some fans hoped Marathon's slow start could convince the studio to focus back on Destiny, but quite the opposite was true, as in May 2026, Bungie announced Destiny 2's upcoming July update would be its last. And with reports stating there are currently no future Destiny projects in active development, that franchise is essentially now on ice. But the bad news didn't stop there, as another round of layoffs was right around the corner. This saw most of the Destiny team and a portion of the Marathon team gone, with nearly 300 more employees impacted. Needless to say, Bungie is not in a good place right now. They have lost over half of their team since being acquired by Sony, their most recent game flopped despite its quality, and their live service cash cow is now largely dead, with no future Destiny plans in sight. Even if Bungie and Sony chose to greenlight Destiny 3 like fans so desperately want, I don't even know if they could at this point. That project would take at least half a decade and cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and I highly doubt Sony is too interested in spending that much more on a Bungie team they've already lost so much on. And that right there is why I am confident saying PlayStation's purchase of Bungie is the worst acquisition in gaming history. Not because they had some controversies or because they released a game that underperformed, but because there has never been a moment, not even for one single second, that Sony has seen any return on their investment. Bungie was supposed to help them maneuver the live service space and ensure the right games made it to market. They were supposed to act independently, rarely needing intervention from Sony, and they were supposed to bolster PlayStation's catalog, delivering high-quality games in a genre that Sony desperately needs to infiltrate. If one or maybe even two of those things didn't exactly go according to plan, you might be able to shrug it off. But the fact that every single one blew up more spectacularly than the last is almost more impressive than this whole thing actually going well. From day one of this partnership, PlayStation has done nothing but burn money on this wildly expensive studio for basically no benefit. And for a company like Sony, that's no small thing. Microsoft, for example, can afford to spend for years on countless studios who aren't doing much of anything, but Sony doesn't have cash like that. That's why I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this may have been the single most damaging financial decision in PlayStation's history. The $3.6 billion they spent acquiring Bungie is gone, and none of it is ever going to be made back. And that's before we even consider the hundreds of millions more they've spent just keeping them afloat. What makes this even worse is that the money lost has had tangible effects across PlayStation Studios and the game output we've seen this generation. Imagine how many games could have been developed with that money. The Insomniac Games hack in 2023 revealed Spider-Man 2 cost $315 million to make, which was considered a comically large number. And yet they could have made 10 of those absurdly expensive Spider-Man games with the money thrown away on Bungie. Now think about the studio closures we've seen. Teams like Blue Point Games would almost certainly still be around if it wasn't for the Bungie purchase. Sony probably could have kept Blue Point up and running for like 5 years with the money they waste on Bungie in a single quarter, and I'm not even exaggerating. But with that money gone, someone had to go, and their teams will continue feeling this impact for many years. This is also why I say the future of Bungie is so uncertain right now. It would appear they have no current project ready for full-scale production or release, meaning Sony would need to keep being their lifeline for at least another half-decade. Do they have that kind of confidence in them to deliver something great? Can they trust that Destiny fans will still be engaged and willing to wait for all that time? Is this once great studio even still the same after losing so much of their talent? These are the questions questions PlayStation needs to answer, and they need to answer them quickly. Because with each passing month, week, day, or even hour that goes by, this acquisition continues to look worse and worse. All of this leads me to the final point of this video, and while it's one I have made in the past, I simply must reiterate it. A decision like the Bungie purchase has had massive ripple effects throughout the PlayStation business, and it's one so catastrophic that it legitimately could have been fatal during a less fruitful time for the brand, which leads me to question how anyone involved with it still has a job. The two main men responsible for this were Jim Ryan, who was CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment at the time, and Hermen Hulst, head of PlayStation First Party. Jim Ryan is gone, having retired in 2024, a retirement that most assumed was one of those handshake agreements where we say it's a retirement instead of publicly firing you. So call it what you want, but either way, that problem is solved. The other culprit, on the other hand, remains. How does Hermen Hulst still hold a leadership role within this company? Can anyone show me a single thing he has done throughout the PS5 generation that has displayed an eye for talent, understanding of the market, or high levels of taste making when greenlighting games? PlayStation First Party was once their greatest asset, and it has deteriorated ever since he took over. All of these studio shutdowns and layoffs are because of his poor decisions. He let teams make games they never should have been making, he believed in products like Concord, and he signed off on the Bungie purchase. So apologies if I'm getting a little sick of his PR statements about how difficult these layoffs have been when they are a direct result of his failures, and yet his next check is still cashing all the same. It's the same shocking lack of accountability that I feel helped sink their main competitor Xbox, and PlayStation is now falling into the exact same trap. As I have outlined today, Bungie is legitimately the worst acquisition in gaming history, but somehow the man responsible for it is still the decision maker. And frankly, it's going to be hard for me to ever take PlayStation seriously again as long as that fact remains true.